there's a thing that emerged, and this was a lot of these were not scientifically researched. They were just practically done when people were trying to look at software development, not even game development, but software development, and trying to figure out like why can't we get, we're writing all these requirements docs and we're, the system shell this and the system shell that. And what they discovered was like it doesn't seem to matter. No matter how specific we try to get, and no matter how much more time we try to spend getting more specific, it only seems to lead to a greater number of opportunities for assumptions that are incorrect to be made. So it's almost like the more specific we get, the more divergent the answer becomes, in a sort of counterintuitive way, or at least it sort of fractionates all over the place, right? Everything just becomes a mess. And what there's this thing that we said, which you have this thing called a user story. Not everybody's a huge fan. Sorry for those out there that aren't. But it was attempting to basically say the user of this, whoever they are, try to specify them to some degree. There's a story they're trying to tell. And instead of saying the system shell or make this feature or build this widget or write this code, it was tell me what the experience is for the user. And so that's why it's called a user story. It was the story of the user. And one of the things that they learned very quickly, and this is still something people struggle with, whatever you write is a placeholder for a conversation with the person who holds that information. So if I have a user story, someone's written out as a user, some type of user, like as a player, I want to blah, so that blah. It's a very simple form, right? And the intention of having this exist is so that we will talk about what that was intended. The interesting thing is, many people didn't interpret that way, and then they tried to make user stories that didn't have to be talked about so that they would save time. And of course, you can imagine what would happen based on your research. Instead, you get just a bunch of people going in different directions because we didn't align. But the second, I think, challenge that people saw with this is that as they looked at those user stories, even after they talked with them, still, when you went and built it, it wasn't right. And the person who was setting that vision or holding whatever that user story, like why this is important, they would go like, wait, why did you build that? And it's because they said this. And I was like, well, that's not what I meant. We talked about it. It's like, yeah, we talked about it. I built you exactly. And so not only was the text insufficient, the text plus the conversation was insufficient. And the real place you learned if you were aligned or not was only when you actually built the thing. And then this leads to a set of other things, like try to get to the thing very quickly. So the faster, because then you can actually learn, okay, are we aligned or not? I won't actually know till you produce something. Anyway, what you were saying, but I started to put a pin in what you were saying, but it was just like, it was all of this was jumping out, and this predates so much of how we think about game development.
And games are harder. So you're making...
And games are, yes.
You're making me think. So I'm not sure if I finished that discussion around, I mentioned these words form and context. So form is, what is to be made? What are we making? Context is where the game creators mostly focus. What are we building? But they ignore the creative part, which is what is to be made. And because they can't articulate that, they say, well, let's make a bit of that game and a bit of that game, and we'll combine them together in a novel way. And however, some people on the team said things like, they hired me for my creativity, and then they took it all away. So the reason why creativity is meant to be define the question, define the form, is so that you can apply creativity in a surprising way that, well, if that's the question that needs answered, I can bring my creativity to the table, in fact, we all can, to deliver that vision. That's why you're meant to define the problem. That's why it enables creativity. The game industry has the exact opposite of that. We cannot, or we're very bad at defining what is to be made. So instead, we will answer what is being made. We will produce it to death. And people said things like, we're not very player experience led in our studio, we're production led. So they knew what they'd be making on any day of any week up for the next X years. But I ask a question, what experience does the feature deliver?
Yeah.
They have no idea. They have no idea what that's for.
Yes.
So I'm mentioning that because not only this is not just a vision problem, this ties directly to creativity and burnout. People were saying, they hired me because I'm really, really good at what I do. And then they took it all away from me by telling me exactly what to do that morning. And several people told stories that I come to work that morning and I'm given what task to do. Make the thing. It's not what do you think should be made, it's make the thing. And they felt their creativity was just, well, where is the creativity? AI may as well do your job at that point. That was mentioned too.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, there's this, the there's two splits here. One is, are you asking me a question and letting me come up with an answer?
Mm-hmm.
Which to do that requires a combination of trust and alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Both need to be present for that to work.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't have trust or alignment, or worse, don't have trust and I don't have alignment, then I can't trust this person and they're not aligned, so I have to tell them exactly what they need to do.
Yeah.
It still doesn't work because, unfortunately, I can't actually communicate effectively enough without a sufficient model based on what you're saying. But I'm going to try to get them to do exactly and I'm going to be basically mandating the solution. So that's one split, is like, are you dealing with a question and are you letting your creative experts deal with the question, or are you just forcing them into solutions that you've preset? And the second split is something I actually have a different model for. I like your form and context. The way I learned this was the idea of there's an audience perspective and a builder's perspective on whatever it is you're doing. And the role of leadership is to basically, to some extent, define and then maintain connection to the audience perspective up and down the entire organization. So we understand why we're doing what we're doing from the audience's perspective, which again is an experiential lens. It's a value-focused lens. And underneath that, you have a builder's perspective, which is essential for making anything, but it serves the audience perspective. And so it's like I can't have a game without building the stuff, but the stuff is not the game. The game is what will come out in the audience perspectives.
Exactly.
So anyway, those are two just stuff that's popping up.
Let's go back to that point. So I mentioned, based on what you said, let's bring in audience. I mentioned there's these two subvisions. Going in, I thought I would only be talking about creative vision. And again, quick summary, I went in to prove that the vision was low quality, the mental model was low quality, there's no player experience. Turned out to be true. But then the surprise was, or one of the surprises, people ignored my creative questions and only talked about the product. So audience, or market opportunity, or market positioning, and things like that. So when you have these two subvisions, but they're on the same team, right? Whenever you have that, so people have different frames, to get those to be an effective team, you need what's called a bridge. And to create a bridge, you're meant to have what's called constructs. You're meant to have constructs in common, right? What that means is there should be things in the creative vision that are similar to things that are in the market vision, so that these two people can see each other's point of view. Guess what there was none of in the mental model? There was no bridge.
Constructs.
So how the product vision people were thinking when they talked about their audience and the market, and how the creative vision people were talking, they would find it very, very difficult to see each other's point of view, at least from an accurate perspective. And it's even worse than that. We're working our way down how many surprises I got. So that's one thing to say, is that first, the second subvision appears, which I didn't expect. So it shows you people are thinking differently on a team. Worse again, there's no bridge. So they find it very, very difficult to communicate in any meaningful way without very basic things like features again. Oh, you're making a game with that features. Well, we'll position it over there. Or your art style's a bit cuter and friendlier. Oh, this one's a bit more edgy. Really basic things. Nothing really to... They would fit in with appeal or preferences. I like that art style, but they're not the same as player experience. Like, what's the psychological feeling that we know about when a game resonates with you? We know what goes on. From my previous player psychology careers. But the game industry is not using that; they're just guessing. So these two people are finding it very, very difficult to communicate. And I hinted that it's worse again. So in psychology, these two sub-views, the creative view and the... I feel sorry for anyone just listening on the audio because I'm using my hands a lot here to show the two
sub-views. No, it's fine.
But these two sub-views, the creative view and the product view, they operate at different levels, psychological levels, right? And usually the product view is seen as controlling the creative view because they control the money. They've got more power, essentially. So don't think of these as equal. You've got this power play at hand where people on the same team are thinking in different frames with with no common bridge, very hard to communicate. One is a known problem in psychology that it's seen as dominating the other, that the organizational level, the product view, has for decades has been seen as controlling the product view. And even though I did not...
the creative view.
The creative view, sorry, yeah. So the product view dominates the creative view. And when I interviewed people, I didn't use all these terms, I was just chatting to them, but people said things like, oh yeah, management, the word dehumanizing was brought up because they said they just see us as, just making a product. We just do the work, but they take all the glory or all the sales or all the rest of it. So they were feeling this they were aware of this problem that's been known about in psychology for decades, that if you in a company, let's say the management layer, for want of a better word, and the creative layer, the team layer, there's been known to be tension between those two levels in an organization for decades. And there's people who researched that exact problem. What's interesting is I did not ask about it in my interviews, but people talked about it, that there was this animosity from both sides, I would say. So the creative people I talk to, for example, would be quite disparaging towards management. Well, they don't play games, or they don't care what we make. They just see it as a black box and things like that.
Yeah. This is all about ROI, money.
Exactly. KPIs, blah, blah, blah. So they often see the game as an art. They don't care about the art, essentially. But the business people would say, well, they don't understand the business, that we have to survive and things like that. And so each side had quite a negative. You would like to think they saw the best in each other, but it was often quite negative towards each other. Quite a lot of friction. But again,
you're the psychologist. I think it is more normal for people to see the worst than the best, especially if there's not a pre-existing relationship.
It really is, and it explains. I think before we talked about postmortems and sitting on projects that failed, and this precise problem we're talking about here, that this bridge, either between a developer and a publisher, or the creative team and the management team, this bridge exists at different levels, right? But it's a known friction point, and if you can't share or see someone else's point of view, then it's hard to trust them. It's hard to build trust or understand why they're doing what they're doing when you have no common frame of reference. So that was it just kept getting worse and worse. That I went in to prove one thing, that even when talking about the creative aspects of your game, I just thought you couldn't do that, which was true. You can't do that. But then it showed that actually there's people on the team who aren't even thinking about creative at all. They're talking about the market or the player or things like that. And then the other problem was, well, there's no way to bridge. They can't even see each other's point of view. So it means the people on the product side, when I asked them specifically, like, tell me how you position your game in the market. Because market conditions gets mentioned a lot these days. We couldn't survive on the market conditions. We couldn't find an audience. Games are being closed for that reason. My research would also say that that's probably their own fault. The way their mental model, the model they're using to position their game in the market, is exactly the same problem that's stopping the creative team aligning on their vision. They're relying on these surface level factors like features, like world building.
World building feature,
When I asked them, how do you position your game in the market? Nobody said we position by player experience. Nobody. So again, they were missing the thing that I would imagine if I was doing market positioning. I'm not in marketing, by the way. But if I was, and somebody asked me, what's the difference between these two games? The last thing I'd be mentioning is features or world building, or that's the easy stuff, right? What I'd be more interested in is what's the player experience. And I think we mentioned before, you could have a first-person shooter that delivers a very similar player experience to a racing game, psychologically. So you could attract that player. And the idea of just going after the same genre or the same features is incredibly crude.